This week, we're going to talk about two things, World War II and the Russian Revolution and communism. So I wanted to really show you some of the various artifacts and things and perhaps tell you some interesting stories. So the textbook chapter is going to talk about the rise of totalitarian regimes, specifically Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. So let's start by talking about Joseph Stalin. So Stalin came to power and really set up what we think of as the Soviet system. So where you didn't have enough consumer goods, Communist Party leaders had special privileges. And since the fall of the Cold War, you've definitely gotten some relics that kind of make it of historical curiosity. So this is a hat an ex-student got me years ago in the Czech Republic. And it's kind of that Russian communist hat with the fur. You got the hammer and sickle symbol. So that is kind of artifact number one. Then you've got this, which is one of my favorite trinkets ever. They sell it at Bevmo. It's called Leninade, and everything on the bottle is some type of joke about communism. Obviously, the liquid's red. It'll say a party in every bottle. On the front, it says get hammered and sickled. Then it says basically surprisingly satisfying taste from Soviet-style soda. It'll say a taste worth standing in line for. It'll get hammered and sickled. Drink, comrade, drink. It's this or the gulag. On the back, you can see some Russian slogans. So it's just kind of an amusing. It doesn't actually taste that good, but kind of funny. This actually I picked up at a flea market in Luoyang, China. And it has, interestingly, as you see the hammer and sickle flag a lot in China, as opposed you would to in Russia. So here is this. You probably won't guess what this is. It's very odd. So you do this, and then it is a camping cup of all the oddities. The next item, this is I picked up actually in Boston, of all places. But it's a Russian babushka doll. And on the top you see Lenin. Then if we undo Lenin, we get to Joseph Stalin. And then we will let Mr. Stalin come apart, and we get Mikhail Gorbachev, the guy who ended it. And then, of course, you can probably guess who's at the bottom. This is Boris Yeltsin, who came after Gorbachev. And then he paved the way for Mr. Putin. And so that is it's a babushka doll. And then the last item for Soviet Russia, I actually got this at a flea market a little bit ago. This is money from Tsarist Russia. So you can see on the back, it's Alexander III, who was in the 1800s. So it's just a piece of money. Soviet currency tends to have like soldiers on it and things such as that. Let's talk World War II. Easily the most violent conflict in world history. Killed 50 million people, which is more than almost all the other wars combined. Really, in some ways, was less of a shock than World War I in terms of what it did to the values of Europe. But it really was a world war, fought from places as far as Alaska, down into parts of Africa, the South Pacific, all over Europe. So in that vein, let's show a few different things. So World War II really took the idea of total war to its apotheosis, in the sense that everything in the society really did get mobilized for the war. So let's show a few things from that. So first, this is fallen apart, but the U.S., for one of its few times in its history, did rationing. So this is a rationing book from Illinois in the 1940s. I'll show you as best I can. It's got coupons for different materials that you would be able to get. So it really wasn't about money. It was about what if you had the right coupons as well. So again, like I said, I've had this for a few years, but it's a little bit fallen apart. But once you would have the coupons are for things like spare tires, wheat, oil, such as that. This is a replica book from Great Britain, who actually had even stricter rationing than we did. So this one, you can see the coupons are a little more intact because it's not the actual thing. But again, they would stamp, you would get your allocation of sugar, and it really was a notion of shared sacrifice. This item is a reprint of instructions they gave to U.S. soldiers stationed in Britain. And it's sort of like a primer for do's and don'ts. Some of the things are interesting in here. It mentions that U.S. soldiers were paid more than their British counterparts. And it talks about things like don't insult the Queen. The joke the British had for the American soldiers in England were they're overpaid, they're oversexed, and they're over here. So that is that. Obviously, you're probably familiar with this. This is the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial. This is the Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. And the statue was so famous that they made like an 80-foot sculpture of it in Washington, D.C. Now, in the vein of total war, this meant mobilizing every segment of your society, including, of course, women. So this is a Rosie the Riveter action figure, obviously from the famous, iconic propaganda poster, which actually is not Rosie the Riveter. The actual Rosie the Riveter was this picture, which is by a Norman Rockwell painting. And obviously the We Can Do It poster, which you see here, that is more famous. And then here's a slightly different version of the We Can Do It poster with yours truly from the World War II Museum. Now, some other interesting oddities. This little item is called a cricket. Now, it's a small little clicker. You can actually use similar things to train dogs. This was given to the U.S. paratroopers before D-Day, the invasion of France. And as they dropped them behind enemy lines, one way to communicate, because you obviously don't want to yell out, hey, I'm an American, is 2 clicks, and then you would wait for the click back. And so all the soldiers were dropped in with this. And then obviously, now let's show you some of the artifacts. So this is really a good symbol for World War II, even though you wouldn't think so, is Spam was actually produced in mass quantities by the U.S. And then they sent it over in a program called Lend-Lease to Russia, which still is one of the biggest markets for Spam. But it's also still eaten in Hawaii, and because it doesn't have to be refrigerated and it lasts for years. So this is a can of Spam, and Russia is one of the biggest markets for this to this day. Now, as far as hardware goes, this item is a real good symbol for what won this war. So this is the Jeep, which was a sort of shortened for, it's an acronym for General Purpose Vehicle, which was GP. And the Jeep was amazing because it could pretty much, very simple design, could pretty much run over just about any kind of terrain, more or less any kind of a road. And it was customizable. So this model has the machine gun mount in the back, but you could put 4 soldiers in there. It could transport people. The windscreen folded down, which this model's been through the ringer. But and it was just, they made millions of these things in all kinds of different configurations. Now, some examples of some things. This was called a Higgins boat. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, this is, of course, what they used in D-Day to land. And so these were, Higgins was this designer, and the factory was in New Orleans, which is why the World War II Museum is in New Orleans. So literally, you would tether these up to a troop ship, and you would go across on the beach and you would storm out. And they had bigger versions of these that would carry tanks. And again, one of the delays on D-Day was they had to make sure they had enough Higgins boats to be able to do the invasion. Now, tanks were obviously really important. They understood what to do with them more than they did in World War II. So one of the most important, and really it came down to how much you could produce. So this is one of the best, this is actually probably the best tank of the war. This is a Russian T-34 tank. It's what's called a heavy tank. They made millions, hundreds of thousands of these things, and they could go toe-to-toe against just about anything the Germans certainly had. And, just very powerful tank. Now, the Germans tended to have amazing tanks, but they were over-engineered, so you couldn't produce a lot of them. This is a Tiger tank. Better than anything the U.S. had. Sort of that sloped armor would make shells bounce off it. But just a very powerful tank. But if you look at the production numbers, they just did not produce nearly as many of these as what the U.S. and Russia did. So this is another German tank. This is a larger one. This is called a tank destroyer. But this again has that enormous gun. So this was going to beat anything on the battlefield. But if you've only got, 5 or 6 of these and the other guy's got 30 of what he has, he's going to be able to take you out. So that is, there you go. Now this is another model of U.S. ingenuity. This is the M4 Sherman tank. Now, this was truthfully a piece of crap. It was not as good as what the Germans were putting out there, or even the Russians. And its armor was thin in the front. The gun would bounce off pretty much a Tiger tank. The only way you could do it is if you got lucky and got behind. So I once saw a documentary on Sherman tank tactics, and basically it was to have 5 of these things, and then you would let 4 be sitting ducks while the 5th one snuck around the back and took it out. I once got a chance to climb into one of these at the World War II Museum, one of the most cramped things you can ever see. If you watch the movie Fury with Brad Pitt, you can get a sense of that. And then lastly, really what ultimately when you get into total war and it's harnessing everything you can to do what it takes, is you have these. Now, I don't have my B-29 model because but these are the atomic bombs. And the U.S., theoretically, this was out there. A lot of the work had been done by German physicists. But when the war started, a lot of those physicists fled to the U.S. And the real kickstart to what was called the Manhattan Project was some physicists wanted to alert the U.S. government, but they knew that if they just wrote a letter, these were guys named Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, and Leo Szilard, nobody was going to pay attention to them. But Albert Einstein had come to America and was living on Long Island. And so they actually went and found him and got him to write a letter to Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, when it's got Albert Einstein's name attached, it gets attention. So the U.S. ultimately put enormous amount of resources into building the atomic bombs. Now, the reason they're different is there's 2 different ways you can create that nuclear fission reaction. One is called the shotgun method, where you have 2 pieces of plutonium, and this is called the little boy bomb. This was the one they knew would work, and you basically shoot them together, and it creates the reaction. So this is the one they dropped over Hiroshima. It's not as powerful, but they knew it would work. The other type of bomb you had was called an implosion plutonium bomb. And the way this one worked was you would have your core of plutonium in the middle, and then you would have explosive charges surrounding it, and they would all shoot in at the same time. And that would create the reaction, giving you a deadly or explosive firepower. This was the one that they dropped on Nagasaki. It's also the one they tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico. They actually didn't have to test this one. They knew it would work. The death toll at Nagasaki was a little bit less because the bomber actually missed its target. Now, the bomber that dropped this Hiroshima bomb is at the Udvar-Hazy Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. And Boxcar, the one that bombed Nagasaki, is actually at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. I've had a chance to see both of them. So anyway, that's just a little introduction to World War II.